Keanu Reeves confronts a rude talk show host. His response leaves the audience speechless. Where from you are watching this video, tell us. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Let's start the video. A quiet Tuesday morning when Keanu Reeves received the invitation. A national talk show, The Jake Nolan Hour, wanted him as the headliner for their season premiere. On paper, it looked like a solid PR move. The show had millions of viewers, top ratings, and a reputation for going viral. But Keanu hesitated. Not because he feared the spotlight, he had lived in it most of his life, but because he knew who Jake Nolan was. Arrogant. Sharp-tongued. Known for tearing down celebrities under the guise of telling it like it is. His style was controversial, but his ratings were undeniable. Keanu, never one to chase attention, initially declined. But after his team convinced him it could raise awareness for his upcoming charity project, he agreed with one condition: no drama. The producers were thrilled. Finally. Someone with real mystique, one of them said, slapping a clipboard. But deep down, the show's writers and Jake himself weren't interested in promoting Keanu's charities or his films. They had another angle. He's too quiet. Too nice. Let's push his buttons a little, Jake said, lounging in his sleek leather chair, scrolling through online rumors and Reddit threads about Keanu's life. The world wants real, right? Let's see what happens when Mr. Zen gets poked. His team laughed. They thought this would be the episode that made headlines for weeks. What none of them realized was that they were about to play a game with someone who didn't play by the same rules. The day of the show arrived. Keanu walked into the studio with his usual low-key presence: black jeans, a worn jacket, and eyes that held stories deeper than the Pacific. He greeted every crew member by name, even the interns. He shook hands with the sound guy and thanked the lighting technician for their work. No entourage. No ego. Just presence. As he sat backstage, sipping tea and reading a worn paperback, Jake prepared his monologue. Don't worry, he told the live audience during rehearsal, we're gonna crack open the most mysterious man in Hollywood. Laughter followed. But some in the audience weren't so sure. Even the stage manager, a woman named Carla who'd worked on dozens of interviews, felt something was off. Feels more like a setup than an interview, she muttered under her breath. As the cameras rolled, the theme music blasted through the studio. Jake strutted out in his usual fashion: sharp suit, smug smile, and swagger that could fill a stadium. Ladies and gentlemen, he shouted into the mic, tonight we've got the one, the only, the internet's favorite mystery man, Keanu Reeves. The crowd cheered, but there was a strange energy in the air. Not electric. Not hostile. Just tense. Keanu stepped onto the stage, his face calm, his gait unhurried. He smiled, shook Jake's hand, and took his seat across from him under the hot studio lights. What followed was the start of a conversation that would take a sharp turn no one expected. At first, Jake kept it light. He asked about Keanu's latest film, cracked a few jokes, even complimented his surprisingly good performance. Keanu chuckled politely and responded with thoughtful, humble answers. The audience laughed when appropriate, clapped on cue. But then Jake shifted gears. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, the questions started to have a bite. So Keanu, he said with a smirk, do you actually enjoy acting? Or are you just, there? You've got that I don't care vibe down to a science. The audience gave a nervous laugh. Keanu smiled faintly. I love the craft, he replied. It's never been about attention for me. I just want to tell stories that matter. Jake leaned in, sure, but it's Hollywood. Let's be honest, don't you think being the sad guy who rides the subway is kind of a brand now? The crowd winced. Some laughed. Keanu's expression didn't change. Backstage, a producer whispered, he's not reacting. Push harder. Jake obliged. He began pulling out old tabloid rumors. "There's so much mystery around you, man. People say you're cursed, that tragedy follows you. Parents, your girlfriend, your daughter. I mean, that's a lot of pain. Ever think you might be bad luck?" The air in the room turned ice cold. A woman in the front row gasped. Keanu blinked slowly, his face unreadable. He adjusted in his chair, then looked Jake directly in the eyes, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling: complete stillness. It was the kind of stillness that made people realize how loud they'd been. At that moment, everyone from the crew to the viewers watching live at home felt it. Something was coming. Not a meltdown. Not a tantrum. But something powerful. Jake, sensing the tension but unable to stop himself, forced a laugh. "Hey, it's all in fun, right? I mean, you're the internet's Buddha. Nothing gets to you." But Keanu didn't laugh. He just leaned in slightly and said, in a soft but steady voice, "Is pain a punchline to you?" The audience froze. That was the moment everything changed. Jake Nolan didn't respond right away. His signature smirk faltered just enough to betray the jolt behind his eyes. The silence following Keanu's question wasn't planned, it was real. The audience sat in a tight, breathless hush. Even the boom mic above them seemed to hover more gently, as if it too didn't want to interrupt. "Is pain a punchline to you?" Keanu had asked it so softly, so deliberately, that the words echoed like thunder in the studio's high ceiling. Jake tried to recover. "Hey, I'm just saying what people think," he chuckled nervously, waving it off like a bad joke that didn't land. But the atmosphere had shifted. The temperature of the room felt different, heavier. Keanu didn't press the issue. He simply looked at Jake and waited, like a man who'd already said everything he needed to say with one sentence. Jake cleared his throat and glanced at the teleprompter. He was used to controlling the tone, but now the control had slipped from his fingers like sand. Still, he pushed forward. All right. Let's reset. You've had one of the weirdest careers in Hollywood blockbusters, memes, now you're like a saint on the internet." He forced a laugh. "How does it feel being everyone's favorite sad billionaire?" Keanu's lips twitched slightly, but not in amusement. He shook his head gently. "I'm not a billionaire," he said. "And I'm not sad. I've just lived. That's all." The audience nodded silently. Something about that line, "I've just lived," carried a kind of grounded truth most people weren't used to hearing on talk shows. Jake's attempt to lighten the mood stumbled again. He turned toward the audience, trying to bring them back with him. "Come on, folks, this guy used to surf and dodge bullets in slow motion, now he rides the subway and reads poetry. That's not exactly the Hollywood fairy tale, is it?" There were a few scattered chuckles, but they were uneasy. Keanu sat there, steady as ever, not trying to win the room, just being himself. And that, oddly enough, made him more powerful than any rehearsed comeback. "I've never been interested in fairy tales," he said. "Fairy tales end. I'm more interested in things that grow." The camera operator leaned in just a little closer. The director in the control room didn't dare cut to commercial. Everyone knew something rare was unfolding live. Jake tried again, this time leaning into Keanu's personal life. "You've had loss. A lot of it. I mean, your girlfriend, your daughter, it's tragic, man. How do you not just fall apart?" The audience collectively winced. It was the kind of question that made people shift in their seats, not out of curiosity but out of discomfort. But Keanu didn't flinch. He sat with it. He let the question breathe. Then, after a few seconds that felt like hours, he replied. "I did fall apart," he said plainly. "Many times. You don't go through things like that and stay the same. You break. But then, if you're lucky, you rebuild. Not to what you were but to something different. Hopefully, something wiser. And maybe, a little more gentle. There was no performance in his voice. No polish. Just truth. Raw, unfiltered, and strangely comforting. Jake didn't know how to respond. The crowd didn't clap yet. They were too moved to even think about applause. Then Keanu turned to Jake and added, "I know this is your job. I know you like to provoke. But there are moments when maybe, it's better to listen than to joke. Especially when the subject is grief." That landed hard. Not just on Jake, but on every viewer at home, every crew member, every person in the live audience who had lost someone and never quite found the words to express it. Keanu had just said it for them. Jake leaned back in his chair. For once, he had no smart comeback. His cards were all on the table now, but Keanu hadn't played the game. He'd rewritten it. The host chuckled softly, not mockingly this time, but as if he'd just come to a realization. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. Keanu nodded. "Most people aren't, if you give them time." There it was again, that calm, understated wisdom. It didn't scream. It whispered. And somehow, that whisper echoed louder than all the noise Jake had built his career on. The cameras kept rolling, but the show no longer felt like a performance. It felt like a conversation. One where the audience had been invited to witness something real. Something that couldn't be edited, scripted, or faked. And as the second segment ended, and the show went to its first commercial break, nobody moved. Not Jake. Not the audience. Not even the camera crew. Everyone just sat there, quietly processing what had happened. Something had shifted in that studio. And they all knew it. The silence that followed the commercial break felt like a reset, but the weight in the studio didn't lift. Jake returned with a forced smile, his voice a touch softer. The show had moved into unfamiliar territory, realness, and he was struggling to decide whether to fight it or lean in. He glanced sideways at Keanu, who sat calmly, as if he had no need to fill the space with noise. The audience, still recovering from the emotional honesty they'd witnessed, waited eagerly, sensing this episode was unlike any they'd seen before. Jake tried to ease back into control, offering a more neutral question. "So, Keanu, you've been called the nicest guy in Hollywood. I mean, you've given away millions, shared trailers with crew members, helped people on the street. What makes you so grounded?" Keanu took a breath and leaned forward, folding his hands. "I don't know if I'd call it grounded," he said. "I just know what it feels like to be invisible. To walk down the street and have no one see you. I remember watching my mother work double shifts just to keep a roof over our heads. I remember sleeping on floors. I remember loss, not just in the movies, but in life. When you felt all that, you don't walk around thinking you're better than anyone else." His tone wasn't defensive. It was matter of fact. And yet, every word felt like it was being carved into the air. Jake looked down at his note cards. The question suddenly felt hollow. He tossed them onto the coffee table between them. "You know," he began, "I usually run this thing with a mix of sarcasm and speed. We bounce around, we keep it light. But I gotta admit, man, you've got a way of stopping all that. You just make people want to slow down." He said it with a strange kind of respect. It was clear even to him now that Keanu wasn't just another guest. He was a mirror, and Jake was starting to see things in himself he hadn't looked at in years. The audience leaned in. The laughter had stopped long ago, but no one was complaining. The energy had shifted into something deeper, and no one wanted to break it. "What do you think fame does to people?" Jake asked, now genuinely curious. Keanu gave a soft smile. "Fame is like a magnifying glass. It doesn't create character, it reveals it. If someone's insecure, it makes them more insecure. If they're arrogant, it makes them more arrogant. And if they're kind, well, hopefully, it amplifies that too. There was a beat of silence before soft clapping broke out across the audience. Not explosive, but genuine. It was the sound of agreement, of connection. Jake nodded slowly. "Has it changed you?" he asked. "Maybe. I mean, it gives you access. To places, to people, to influence. But it also isolates you," Keanu replied. "There are days when you wonder if anyone truly knows you. Not the image, not the myth. You. That's why I don't take it too seriously. At the end of the day, I go home, make tea, read, feed my dog. That's real." The way he spoke about simplicity made it feel like a treasure, not a fallback. The audience seemed to hang on his every word, not because he was acting, but because he wasn't. Jake rubbed his chin, clearly processing everything. "Man," he said, half laughing, "I think I've spent most of my career avoiding conversations like this. Always felt safer making fun of everything. Keeps people from looking too close." Keanu didn't respond with pity or judgment. He just nodded. "Humor's a shield. I get that. But sometimes, you gotta put the shield down to actually feel something." That line hit differently. Even Jake leaned back with a long exhale, like he'd been holding in a breath for years. The third segment of the show was supposed to feature a light-hearted game or rapid-fire Q&A. Producers in the booth scrambled to adjust the plan. But something told them to just let it ride. This wasn't the show they scheduled, it was better. And no one wanted to be the one to interrupt it. Jake reached for his water, took a sip, and looked at Keanu again. "You ever get tired of people putting you on a pedestal? Like, always expecting you to be this perfect guy?" Keanu laughed a soft, warm sound. "All the time," he said. "But I don't worry about that. I'm not trying to be perfect. I mess up like anyone else. I've said the wrong things, trusted the wrong people, made bad decisions. The difference is, I try to learn from them. I try to be better. That's all I can do." The crowd responded with light applause again. But this time, Jake clapped too, slowly, sincerely. He wasn't clapping for Keanu the actor, he was clapping for Keanu the human being. The moment didn't need to be wrapped in a bow. It stood on its own, unfiltered, unscripted, and unforgettable. And as the third segment drew to a close, Jake looked into the camera and said, "I don't know about y'all, but I think this might be the most real interview I've ever had on this stage." The audience cheered, louder this time, but still with that sense of respect. They knew they were witnessing something rare. And Keanu, ever humble, simply smiled, nodded, and looked out into the sea of faces as if to say, "Thank you for seeing me." The next day, social media was on fire. Clips from the interview were everywhere on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even trending on Reddit. Memes were being made, not mocking anyone, but honoring the shift that had occurred on live television. One tweet read, "Keanu just taught that talk show host more about life in 20 minutes than 4 years of college ever could." Another said, "I came for the jokes, stayed for the truth. This is what television should be." Jake's team was flooded with messages, producers, celebrities, strangers from small towns across the country all reaching out to say the same thing, that episode was different. That episode mattered. Jake sat in his office, staring at his screen as the numbers rolled in: views, shares, likes. He had always measured success by how loud people laughed. But now, the quiet admiration hitting his inbox hit harder than any applause ever had. Keanu, meanwhile, had gone back to his normal rhythm. The moment wasn't something he carried like a trophy. It wasn't a victory, it was just truth, spoken plainly. When his assistant mentioned that the clip was going viral, he simply nodded and said, "That's nice," then turned back to reading the book in his hands. He hadn't intended to leave a mark. He hadn't tried to go viral. That was never his goal. But the honesty of his words and the stillness of his presence had tapped into something people were starving for: authenticity. In a world full of noise, Keanu had given them silence worth listening to. Jake couldn't get the interview out of his head. That night, after the studio emptied out, he stayed behind and watched the full footage alone. He paused during the moment where Keanu talked about fame-revealing character. That line echoed in his mind. He thought about all the masks he'd worn, all the jokes he'd used as armor, and how he'd slowly built a career on being the guy who never got too serious. But now, for the first time in years, he wanted to do more than make people laugh. He wanted to make them feel. And he knew exactly where that shift had come from. It came from sitting across from a man who didn't need the spotlight to feel whole. A few days later, Jake made a decision that caught everyone by surprise. He opened the next show not with a joke, not with a celebrity, but with a monologue, raw, vulnerable, and unrehearsed. He spoke directly to the audience, looking into the camera with none of the bravado they were used to. "Last week," he began, "I sat across from Keanu Reeves, and something changed in me. I've spent a lot of my life hiding behind sarcasm, but that conversation reminded me that the truth is more powerful than any punchline." The studio was quiet. The crowd wasn't sure how to respond. Then slowly, applause began to build, not thunderous, but meaningful. Jake nodded and continued, "So from now on, this show is gonna look a little different. We'll still laugh, don't worry. But we're also gonna listen more. We're gonna talk about what really matters. And that starts now." The audience watched as Jake brought out a young community activist from the Bronx, a woman fighting against homelessness and food insecurity. It wasn't the typical guest. She didn't have a new album or a blockbuster movie. But she had a voice, and Jake let her use it. That night, the show felt different. It felt human. And across the country, viewers noticed. The ratings didn't drop. In fact, they climbed. People were hungry for something real. And all of it traced back to one quiet moment, one unexpected confrontation, and one man who refused to play along with the script. Back at home, Keanu caught the episode by accident. He was flipping channels when he saw Jake's face, softer now, more honest. He watched in silence as Jake delivered his monologue. Keanu didn't smile or shake his head. He just sat there, holding a mug of tea, watching a man step into himself. That was enough. He didn't need credit. He didn't need recognition. What mattered was that something had shifted, and maybe, just maybe, a little more light had entered the world. Weeks passed, and the buzz around the interview didn't fade, it deepened. News outlets ran think pieces about the moment. Hollywood hit pause and reflected. Podcasts dissected the encounter, highlighting how a simple, unscripted exchange had shifted the tone of entertainment. Online forums that usually overflowed with sarcasm were now filled with sincere gratitude. Messages like "Keanu reminded us how to be human," and "that host got humbled in the best way," continued to pour in. But it wasn't about humiliation anymore. What people witnessed was transformation. Jake wasn't just a late-night host now, he was becoming something more: a facilitator of genuine moments in a world that usually hid behind the mask of performance. Jake's show had become a different kind of platform. He started inviting people who weren't household names but whose stories mattered: teachers, volunteers, survivors, dreamers. He'd still crack a joke here and there, it was part of who he was, but he didn't use humor to dodge the truth anymore. He used it to invite it in. Ratings stayed strong, not because the show chased trends, but because it now chased meaning. And in quiet moments between tapings, Jake would often think about that night with Keanu: the pause, the stillness, the shift. It hadn't just been good television, it had been a wake-up call. He sometimes wondered what it was about Keanu that sparked it all. It wasn't what he said exactly. It was how he said it. Calm. Certain. without ego. It made people want to be better. One evening, Jake received a letter handwritten, neat, no return address. It simply read, "You found your voice. Stay true to it." K. Jake stared at it for a long time, smiling softly. He didn't need to ask who sent it. He knew. It wasn't meant for publicity. It was a quiet reminder from someone who understood the power of silence more than anyone. That note didn't get framed or posted on social media. Jake kept it tucked in his wallet like a compass, a private reminder of what really mattered. And in the days that followed, anytime he felt tempted to slip back into the old habits of easy laughs and shallow bits, he'd pull it out, read it once, and get back on track. Meanwhile, Keanu went on with his life, quietly as ever. He returned to shooting a new indie film, one no one expected him to do but one that moved him deeply. He declined big press tours, choosing instead to visit schools and hospitals between takes. When fans approached him, he treated them like friends, not admirers. He listened more than he spoke. He helped when he could. He didn't make announcements about his donations or his good deeds, he just did them. He remained the man who had walked into that studio and changed everything without raising his voice or demanding attention. He was, in every sense of the word, present. Months later, Jake invited Keanu back on the show. He didn't know if Keanu would accept, he half expected a polite no. But a few weeks before the season finale, his producer handed him a simple message: "Keanu's in. No prep. Just talk." And that's exactly what they did. When Keanu walked out onto the stage, the crowd gave a standing ovation, not for a movie star, but for a man who had reminded them of something real. Jake greeted him with a warm hug, no sarcasm this time, just respect. The conversation that followed wasn't groundbreaking in the traditional sense. They talked about books, childhood memories, kindness, loss, hope. And yet, it felt like the most important dialogue happening anywhere in the world that night. As the show wrapped, Jake turned to the camera, his voice steady. "Tonight, I want to thank a man who didn't come here to impress you, but ended up inspiring millions. Thank you, Keanu, for being exactly who you are." The audience rose again, not out of habit, but from the heart. Keanu gave a small nod, humble as ever. No speeches, no grand exit. He simply smiled and said, "Thank you for listening." The lights dimmed, the credits rolled, and the studio emptied out. But what lingered wasn't just a memory of a good episode. It was something deeper, a reminder that in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak with honesty, stand your ground with grace, and walk away without needing applause. And just like that, the man who never needed the spotlight left behind a legacy far brighter than any camera could capture. Not because he tried to be unforgettable, but because he chose, in every moment, to be real.